You know, I don't believe we ever had any idea what would end up being here.
So the demand for travel is here now, and it's going to be there for a long time.
The airport is so different.
And it is constantly evolving and changing, particularly with technology. As a result, change at the airport happens.
That means that we have to work really hard on being effective in our planning and then our execution of that.
This one, this big old biplane from 1928 into the early 30s was pretty much the standard of airline travel. It was big and comfortable. It had a lavatory, it had heating, that sort of thing. But it's still pretty much old-fashioned design when a couple years later, 1935, now you've got the DC-3, and that's a totally modern airplane. Where we're standing is almost at the exact spot that aviation began in the Seattle area. You go back about 100 years, 115 years or so, 1910. This area that's now developed as Boeing Field and Museum of Flight was nothing but big open space next to more freely flowing Duwamish River and one structure that was called the Meadows, and it was a racetrack. So it had bleachers and a racetrack for horse racing, and then an airplane flight. So the very first flight was made out of that stadium. Thousands of people came to see this. It had never been seen before in Seattle. Charles Hamilton, known as the crazy man of the air, made a demonstration in his rickety old biplane from this spot, almost exactly the same spot that we're on right now. And that started aviation in the Seattle area, the Puget Sound area.
Seattle was a small town. People think of Seattle in terms of what it is now or what it was even after Microsoft really exploded. But Seattle back in the 1940s was a very small town. It was really industrial on the waterfront, and that's what the port had a big influence in. And what became the airport out at Bow Lake really was hard for a lot of people to imagine at first, but what the port correctly identified is how big it would become.
So aviation was very important to this part of the country from a very early time. And that probably helped the Boeing company. The Boeing designs were built with that in mind. So some of the early planes were ones that they had that capability built into them. They needed planes that could fly high enough over mountains, land on undeveloped fields, because there weren't very many airports at the time. We're talking about the 1920s, you know. And that became really kind of the stock and trade of aviation. Aviation was competing with the railroads in long distance travel, and the airplanes that were coming out of here provided a reliable way to do that. So they needed now more or less a real airport. So there was this pressure to have a real airfield here. So King County got together with the property owners here. Property was bought, it was improved, and by the mid-1920s, they started building an airport, a real airport with runways and an air terminal. In 1928, it became Boeing Field and Boeing Air Terminal. And that established really the aviation hub for the Northwest at that time in the 1920s and 1930s. This seemed to be the future. Then something happened called World War II, and that changed everything.
So my dad was a pilot, and he got shot down during the war and spent about 13 months in a Nazi POW camp. Then he came back from the war, and flying was his life. He loved flying, everything flying. He would take us up in the plane. I threw up. That was my big memory.
Most of the large civilian airfields were closed to civilian operations. Boeing Field was closed to civilian operations actually on December 6th, 1941. So that changed aviation in the Seattle area. You had these small airlines like United Airlines was flying out of here. They needed someplace else to go.
So it was clear that an airport was needed. And then there was a question of who's going to build it. And it was at a meeting of the Seattle Chamber of Commerce that it was announced that the port would take over that role. And there was reluctance from a lot of people to build the airport because Boeing Field at the time wasn't profitable. But it was clear to business leaders in Seattle and King County and Pierce County that an airport was needed. And it was also clear that an organization with innovative leaders and skills would be needed to champion that project and to fund it, because that was a big issue. So there was talk about where to put the airport, and one of the areas was out at Bow Lake, and there was a lot of land available there. When they got that area, they thought it was sufficient for years and years and years, and it was for a while, but it would be hard to really capture in people's imagination the growth that this region saw in the 75 years since that opening. They were talking about where to put it, and it was important to have it between the two major cities of Seattle and Tacoma. And then slowly things progressed. There was the paving of the first runway and the surveying before that. Those were all key steps. And then the first flight, the first international flight. Those were all big moments. And then to have that central terminal open in 1949, that was really the capstone of the celebrations. And if you look at every year of the airport, from when it was announced in the early 40s into the 1970s, there was a major project and major innovation every year. And even in the decades going forward, almost every year there's been something major that has happened at SEA.
Hello everybody from Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. The Seattle-Tacoma is a real layout. And the administration building, which you see there, which cost $3 million, is considered as the most functional such airport building in the United States.
It was a huge deal to have the central terminal open. It was broadcast live on the radio. It was an event that everybody knew about. It was like a Super Bowl for the region. It was just the biggest thing around, because not only to have an airport, but to have such a grand facility. And it was one where elected officials, everybody who was anybody in politics wanted to be there, and they were.
The Port of Seattle owns and operates Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, and it's quite an operation. There is no doubt but what it is one of the finest in the nation, as any seasoned air traveler will tell you.
Being 3, just short of 4, I'm actually surprised, but the biggest memory I have was that it was this hot, hot day. And you think about it, and this is acres of concrete absorbing all the heat, and not a tree, no shade. But then I got thinking about it, and I remember my sister was saying that we were going to go fly in an airplane. And like I told you, I was really excited, but I had no idea what an airplane was. But they were giving out Cokes. And I don't think I had ever had a Coke before, because I didn't know how to drink it out of the bottle. And that's pretty much all I remember.
And it was something that not only drew attention regionally, but also nationally, to have Seattle on the map. Not just a far out city, off on the West Coast, in the northwest corner, but it was a marker, a kind of marker in the sand there to say, hey, we're now one step closer to being the city that we know, that other people will recognize more fully.
A giant of the skies from the Far East arrives at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport.
Seattle and King County and this whole region were shaped by Boeing. It had such a tremendous influence here. To understand that innovation, to make Seattle and this region such a leader internationally in air travel, of course influenced the port, and it was such a big driver in terms of not only awareness but also action.
United 612, you're cleared over Ellensburg to Denver. And he is airborne. To us, this is still a thrilling sight, a big plane getting into the air.
The airport is so different, and that also changes the type of wildlife that we have to encounter and deal with.
The whole thing was an exercise in technical rigor. We had to prevail in every single case. The opponents only had to win once.
Folks came out here and actually closed the airport down.